Hello, everybody. Welcome to Design and Review. I'm your off-screen moderator, Kyle, and this is our second speaker session from this series. And the goal we're trying to get at with Design and Review is to explore how different industries and disciplines can tackle design problems. So, a quick couple of housekeeping items before we get rolling. You might not be able to see all the other participants out there in the WebEx, but you're not alone out there. We're watching you from the moderator station. So if you have a question throughout the session, just please type it away in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we hear your questions and address as many of them as we can at the end of the session. If you're having any technical difficulties at all, please feel free to send me a ping, and I'll see if I can help you troubleshoot. So for the folks in the room, if you have any questions at the end of the session, we got a microphone here down at the front. Feel free to come on down and ask us a question. And without any delay, I'm going to pass you over to Monica Kidd.
Great, thanks, Carl. Thanks for inviting me to be part of the series. You and I were just talking offline about the previous speakers who've been in this session, and I feel like I should preface the talk with, and now for something completely different. Okay, bear with me here. I gotta share my slides. Oh, yeah, there we go. Can folks see that online, or have I still not done that right?
No, we don't see online. Let's just have a quick look.
So off to a roaring start here.
No, that's okay. No problem. It's kind of extra interfaces to deal with. Right, so we'll go to WebEx, and we will share PowerPoint. There we go. And I think the folks online should see that.
Yes, excellent. Thanks very much. We're doing this as a hybrid event. It's kind of crazy to be in front of a lecture hall again. It's been a while. Anyway, I thank you for joining us. Title of my talk is Making a Thing from Words. When I was invited to be part of the lecture series, I thought, well, first of all, I thought, oh my God, how did I get the gig? Because I don't consider myself necessarily a designer, but I do a lot of different things, and I have my feet in a lot of different worlds. And every project does, of course, require asking yourself questions about how to solve a problem and taking certain steps to solve a problem. So if we think of design loosely in those terms, I'm going to kind of walk you through some experiences of design in art. So the Monica Kidd School of Design disclaimers, following my lead or any advice implied in this talk may lead to chaos and financial ruin. And most of this I made up as I went along, as most of us do. So I did want to give you some kind of touchstones for how I approach creative projects, and they are three. So curiosity and generalism, and also writing is the backbone of all creative projects I take on, I believe. Just some ways to get you thinking about curiosity. So Susan Sontag was an American writer, and she wrote a number of books about society, illness as metaphor, on regarding the pain of others, on photography. She's someone who's given a lot of consideration to how people observe others and how they interpret others. And I love what she said about curiosity. She said, do stuff, be clenched and curious, not waiting for inspiration's shove or society's kiss on your forehead. I guess I should back up a little bit and tell people a little bit about my sort of bio background stuff. So I'm a physician. I'm a family doctor. I deliver babies. But I started out as a seabird biologist. That's how I came to Newfoundland first, was as a seabird biologist. I worked for a couple of summers on the coast of Labrador. And I decided, I sort of fell in love with Newfoundland when I was here in those summers, and I moved here from, I was living in Ontario at the time doing grad school in biology. And when I came here, I figured I would work in biology. But life throws you curveballs, and I ended up freelancing at CBC Radio. And I ended up working there full time for 7 years. And towards the end, the last couple of years, I was national science reporter and worked for a program called Quirks and Quarks. And in that last year is when I decided to pivot again over to medicine this time. And all through running parallel to that time was writing for me. I've written a bunch of books, 7 books, poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. And so I sort of have my feet in a number of different worlds, as I mentioned to you before. So the reason what Susan Sontag said about curiosity, the reason that speaks to me is because, like many people, I've let curiosity be the carrot that leads me from one thing to another. People often ask the question, well, how did you get from, how did you, you speak to medical students and, a common question is, well, how did you get into medicine? What was your path? And I always preface it by saying, well, don't follow what I did, my God, because I never really started out knowing where I was going to end, which is not always the best idea in designing a project, but sometimes it leads you to interesting places. So don't wait for anybody to shove you or anyone to say it's your turn to walk into this project. You just have to be willing to follow your curiosity. Generalism now. Generalism. I guess the thing that's propelled me throughout is generalism and kind of not being all wrapped up about the possibility of failure. So I love what Robert Heinlein was, an American science fiction writer, actually, and he said, a human being should be able to change a diaper, plan an invasion, butcher a hog, con a ship, design a building, write a sonnet, balance accounts, build a wall, set a bone, comfort the dying, take orders, give orders, cooperate, act alone, solve equations, analyze a new problem, pitch manure, program a computer, cook a tasty meal, fight efficiently, die gallantly. Which I love on so many levels. I mentioned that I'm a family doctor, and I always used to joke, if I ever wrote a memoir about medical school, I was going to call it Just a Family Doctor, because people they have good intentions, but they often say to you, are you going to specialize, or are you just going to be a family doctor? As though being a generalist was somehow less than being a specialist. And I think in our society in general, people have been attracted to, pushed towards specialization to a great degree. And then along comes a pandemic, and we can't necessarily access specialist equipment or specialist people with skills. And suddenly we take a step back and go, actually, it's really useful to be able to fix your own house when you can't get a contractor to come. Not that I'm able to, but as an example. So I think as a society, we maybe are starting to appreciate generalism a bit more. And I tell you, even in medicine, family medicine, interest in family medicine as a specialty, quote unquote, is starting to increase, because I think we start to see specialists who aren't getting the kinds of jobs they thought they would, and suddenly generalism is looking really attractive. So what this guy said about generalism is, I sort of feel like it needs a marching band behind it. I love it. And I think in Newfoundland, as a society, I think Newfoundlanders, more than many places in Canada, have certainly maintained that respect for generalists and the ability to create really skilled, creative, interdisciplinary generalists. And finally, just the writing. I love what George Orwell had to say about writing. I had the lonely child's habit of making up stories and holding conversations with imaginary persons. And I think from the very start, my literary ambitions were mixed up with the feeling of being isolated and undervalued. I knew that I had a facility with words and a power of facing unpleasant facts. I think a lot of people look at writers as people who, I won't say it that way. I think many writers would agree that the impetus for writing comes from some desire to sort of scream into the darkness, whatever that darkness is. which I certainly can identify with Orwell's comment. All right, enough for the preliminaries. What I do want to tell you about design and my approach to design is that the most successful projects I've had, I've had that success because I have had the ability to surround myself with really smart people. I really enjoy working. You know, writers are lone wolves, but and that can be really useful at times. But I really enjoy toggling over to working in a group of people who know things that I don't know and see the world in ways I don't see. And I think that is advice that anyone can carry over to any kind of design project, is just the importance of having a team that gels, and making sure that you don't surround yourself by people who are carbon copies of yourself. It's good to get diversity. It's good to get people who poke you and disagree with you. It shows you where the holes are. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 things today if we have time. The first one is design experiences in making a book. I'm talking about a novel in this case. I was acquisitions editor for a publishing company called Platen Press. And this is a novel that I acquired. So somebody submitted the manuscript. I read it, I liked it. And then from there, I work with the author to edit it. And then we contract a designer who actually typesets the book and talks about layout and cover art and whatnot. So Sue Kroll was the author. She's based in Edmonton. And Emma Alain is the designer based in Halifax. So I called them up and I recorded a little conversation with them because I thought a tripartite conversation with the 3 people involved in the book in this case might be useful.
So first, for this talk, I wanted to talk about why the book appealed to me and why I thought it would be good for Peddler. So first, it was the quality of the writing, the quality of the manuscript. That always has to come first. Secondly, it was a book about exploring the female gaze, which is not something that's received a whole lot of attention in literature, I felt. And I'm just going to read you Peddler's mandate to show you how it fit in with Peddler. So Peddler's mandate was to acquire works of exceptional literary quality, which also breaks silences regarding widespread failures of social and political systems, to make books with serious intellectual and emotional content. In other words, that are also works of art. Now, here's the catalog copy that we came up with for Sue's book, and hopefully that'll give you an idea of how it did fit with Peddler's mandate. When art student Mira Seme loses her father, she becomes preoccupied with images of flesh and anguish. Martin Zorn becomes her lover and muse, his body's every detail she commits to paper. It's not the first time Zorn has been curated. His sister, photographer Marie Claire Zorn, spent her career working to record every gesture her younger brother made, every emotion he expressed. She made them both famous and eventually destroyed them. Seeing Martin is Sue Kroll's debut novel, a work that investigates the predatory gaze, the tidal pull between artist and model, between the seeker and the sought. It's about grief and how grief can be held at bay, at least temporarily, by sex and art. So that's why it fit in with the mandate, I felt. And a big part of it too was that I was intrigued by the design possibilities of the book. And you'll come to see later that this was not going to be a book that was going to be straight ahead, as Emma will be able to attest to later, I'm sure. But I really felt that the design would contribute to the narrative, which I found intriguing. And then finally, I thought that Sue was going to be great to work with. And I don't think that we can ever underestimate the value of having a team that just works well together to take a thing from an idea to something you hold in your hands. So Sue, I'd like to bring you in here. The book has lots of design features that Emma will talk about, I think, in greater detail. But I guess just as a spoiler alert for for folks. There were kind of four main components as I saw it. So there was the main narrative, which looks like this, which looks like a sort of standard novel that people will have read. And then there's the notebook of Mary Claire Zorn. So I'll just show you an example of what that looks like. So it's a different typeface, and it has a different visual appearance, and it signaled to the reader that something else was happening here. There was a different voice being communicated. And then there were fictional newspaper clippings that looked like that. And then if that weren't enough, there was even an imagined film script. And I'll just show you a little sample, which looks like that. So if anyone's ever kind of looked at a script for a play or a film, that's what it looked like. So Sue, why did you feel that the book needed these visual components?
Well, there's three different characters, and I guess that's common in novels, and you can just title each section differently. Well, two reasons. One of them was I wanted to have Mary Claire's notebooks look different. And at first I thought, well, I could change the font, and then I thought it was, oh, this is too gimmicky. And I think at that point I actually asked you that, and you said, no, try it. So then I think this was already in the editing process, and I went back and I liked that. I liked that you got this instant visual cue. The reader got an instant visual cue, which you would have gotten anyway if it said notebook at the top. But I really liked that was different. It looked different. And all of the characters have a different look. I mean, even Martin's sections, which are straight dialogue sections like a play, have an M dash at the beginning of each dialogue. But I think that's still written in Times New Roman. I think that's standard type. But then once you sort of gave the go ahead that you were interested in it, I really, really loved that the art criticism and the newspaper pages had that different look. They had that line on the top. They had, and I think in the notes you said in broadcast journalism, you call it actuality. And I've never heard that word, but I love that. And I know sometimes I have read books that sometimes will set off with a little newspaper clipping. And I really like that. The reader knows that we're in a different place once they start going, but in a book that's about visual artists, it was really wonderful to have this extra design component. And I know Emma will talk more, but I think there's 5 or 6 different typefaces, different fonts. And I think I hope that as the reader goes through, you'll cue in, oh, now I'm with Marie Claire. Now I'm in a therapy section. Now I'm reading a newspaper. Now I'm reading a journal. Now I'm with the main text, which was, the Myra sections, which were like a third person limited narration. So I just thought that the design just reinforced what I could only do with words, with manuscripts. So I loved how it all, the look of it at the end.
I'm actually curious how readers responded to you. Did you hear from readers about that aspect?
A lot of people said to me, oh, I didn't know what was happening at first. And this was probably the first time we switched from regular main narrative to a notebook early on. But then I kept reading, and then it was like, oh, now I could see how I was going back and forth between different narrators, and it seemed to work.
Well, when we were setting to make this book, I knew that we had to have a really skilled designer, because this was not going to be for the faint of heart. So I knew that Emma was the person to do it for us. So Emma, what was this whole project like for you? And be honest, you can tell me that it made you want to jump off a bridge.
It didn't make me want to jump off a bridge. Yeah, I think it was really interesting for me because I did, I think, one other novel with Peddler, and I've done other novels with other presses, and usually it's just sort of flowing text and then making sure everything looks good. And so it's like a lot of like walls of text. So I felt like this was felt more like doing a poetry book, but very, very long and with a lot more text, because the poetry books that I've done with Peddler and also with some other presses are, tend to have more experimental layouts and things like that. So it's been, it was pretty interesting. I can show you the file. Okay, I'm gonna do that now. Okay, so you can see that.
And you're using InDesign for this, is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So basically the process, for the very, very basic foundational stuff, the process for designing a book for me is I get the Word document and then I have to port everything over into the InDesign document. So it's a lot of copy pasting, and formatting doesn't copy over. So a lot of my job is tediously going through and making sure that the italics are back in place and things like that. So yeah, this is how the book is set up. And you can see, I'm just gonna, you can see all the pages over here. InDesign's kind of overwhelming the first time you see it. So, but you can see all the pages kind of laid out here. And my job was to figure out like each of the sections and what font would go with each section. So sometimes that was easy, like with the script pages. I'll jump down to those. The script was pretty simple because it kind of had to be, I guess, Courier. I just went with regular script pages. So kind of like the formatting stuff, I just looked it up and figured out it absolutely has to be that to be recognizable as a script. And everything else was a little bit less obvious. So the newspaper pages, I figured, because they're generally not necessarily always newspapers, kind of like art magazines and things like that, photography magazines, that it should be something that looked really modern. So I went with a condensed sans serif. So I went with Avenir here, and then a condensed sans serif for the titles. So it's all Avenir. And then that was in these sections, you could have kind of a lot of a little bit less precision on the typesetting because it's a magazine and it's done in columns. But I'll go back to the beginning.
That's something a reader is used to, having columns and seeing that in newspapers. So I guess it just authenticates it more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing, is that because I saw that there were real life applications to these. It wasn't just different voices. I was it needs to feel believable. Mm-hmm. So then for the regular narrative, I just used Caslon, just ITC Caslon, very nice. I knew it had nice italics. And the chapter headings are repeated from the cover. So it's this really beautiful font Moire or Moret. And that's from the one that was used on the cover of the book. So there's
I once had a typesetter tell me, a bit tongue-in-cheek, when in doubt, set it in Caslon.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tried and tested font for sure. I think, so the notebooks are also Avenir, but it's a more condensed version. So I tried really as much as I could to make it as few fonts as I could, so that it wouldn't feel too scrapbooky or too kind of chaotic, but at the same time signaling to the reader that it's a new area. So this is kind of sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I remember having a conversation about the line justification in the notebook section. Mm-hmm. It looks good to the eye to have it flush left and right. But then I remember thinking, well, in a notebook, you're not, in an actual notebook, like in a diary, you're not going to have, so should we have it ragged right margins?
Yeah.
In the end, we decided to do it this way. And I think it certainly looks cleaner on the page to have it flush.
I thought we tried having the not flush margin at one point, and in theory it's better, but visually this looks good. This
Yeah.
looks better. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in terms of typesetting, you kind of have to balance like what could be exhausting for readers, because like if you have something completely left justified, it can be tiring to kind of jump over those lines all the time. So it's like, you know, what works with the narrative and what works with, you know, making it easier for people to read.
And what's invisible to the reader at this point is that you give us a draft, and you've already done a lot of this work, but then we sort of give it a second glance as well. Like then we look to see about the spacing in between words, and sometimes we have to say, you know what, actually, geez, you could drive a truck between those two words. So is there a way to, you know, move up the word from the lower line up to the line above it so that the spacing looks nicer to the eye? And also, we try to avoid having a word hyphenated at the end of the line. Again, we just want a clean, modern look. And that work is quite exhausting, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a peddler in-house style guide thing, and it was definitely made my job harder. But it does look nicer.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, just, you know, this was kind of like bigger InDesign stuff, but basically what I had done was I made these paragraph styles. So each, as I click on them, you can see this one's called article. You can see this one's called notebook. That one's just called body. So basically this made my life easier because I defined the styles. And then when I copy pasted more text, like in the next section, I could, if it was a body section, I could click body and it would, I wouldn't have to like set it again manually. So that's, yeah, that's basically the way that it works.
Can you make some general comments about how you know, conceptually, you get a Word document, and you've talked about copying and pasting and making sure the italics are there and whatnot, but conceptually, what goes through your mind when you sit down to design any book, not this book in particular, but, you know, taking something from an idea to an object?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot happens. Obviously, I try to read as much of the book as I can. It's not always like feasible time-wise to read it cover to cover, but I definitely, if there's like longer descriptions or design briefs, I read those in detail and then try to, you know, look through the manuscript. There's a lot of back and forth with the publisher to figure out sort of like what the vibe is and what the author wants also. Obviously, that's super important. And then it's just sort of a process of kind of like just going on how I'm feeling about it, and then trying some things out and going back and forth. So I'd say it's very collaborative. Quite often for me, what that means with type is kind of figuring out like what era of type to go with. Like if something feels very modern, this book felt like it was like almost both modern and classical. So it made sense to have Caslon, which is like a really clean, nice font, but it's still very classic, of course. But then have Avenir and some of these other newer fonts in there. But sometimes, you know, some other books I might use something older like Baskerville that is like literally older type-wise, because you really like as a reader, it's all these subtle things that you would never think about as a reader, but you do get the feeling of it, and it does kind of signal something to you that that this book, you know, has something going on with it, and the design is meant to complement the text, of course.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
Do either of you have anything else you're burning to say about the production of Seeing Martin?
Oh, it was a great experience. It was a great editing experience for me. And then this further level of collaboration with Emma sending a whole lot of samples, or through you sending, that was really interesting. And again, it just gave it a whole other dimension.
Wonderful. Thanks to you both.
So that was our talk about making a book, taking a manuscript and taking it into book format. Now I'm going to show you another little video. This one's shorter, and this one is This one is about making a film. So I had the good fortune to direct a film with the National Film Board last year called The Storm. And it ended up being, it started out as a one-page essay reflecting on the experiences of delivering babies during a pandemic, when most people were sort of focused on death and despair and isolation. Yet in the midst of that, people were still having babies and bringing new babies into the world and starting families and adding to their families. And it was a real contrast. So a producer with the National Film Board, Annette Clark, had asked me to submit something and maybe we could make it into a film. So I had a one-page essay that she liked. And in discussing with Annette various visual treatments for it, and we thought about documentary, we thought about live action. In the end, we settled on an animated film because to me, I mean, first of all, it was really exciting to become part of the tradition of the National Film Board shorts, but also it got around the problem of patient confidentiality. You know, I didn't want to have to negotiate cameras or images of patients. And I wanted to tell the story I wanted to tell more of a universal story. So we settled on animation, and I worked with local animator Duncan Major. So again, I called up Duncan, and we had a brief conversation about the making of The Storm.
Yeah, I mean, I've always started with words whenever whenever I'm coming up with a design. Like I work as a graphic designer and as a visual artist sometimes, and I like to start with words. And so it was nice for me, and it felt very natural. I was thinking of your pieces. You mentioned it was kind of an essay, but to me, it felt kind of like a prose poem or something like that. So I felt it didn't feel that much different than maybe doing like a book illustration, a book illustration for this thing. And then, you're just like then animating that and making it breathe life into it so that it moves. Yeah, it really started once I read the piece. We had a little meeting. We came up with some ideas. We talked about some artwork on your wall. I think you had this really nice piece. It was kind of a cloud scape and on just some very soft kind of graphite on paper or something like that. And so that kind of spawned the idea of maybe just having it be kind of sketch based. And of course, there was also the challenge too of creating this animation within a short time frame. There isn't really the time to create full backgrounds, to create full characters that move through backgrounds in 3D space. It's all gets very complicated, and oftentimes it either takes a couple of years to do that if you're doing it by yourself, or you have an entire team of animators that are doing that. So it was really just like me and you and Annette, and the three of us kind of creating this thing that could be quickly produced. So yeah, it came up with and then we did these sketches here, right? I did these sketches and sent them to you, and you liked the direction it was going. And I think in between there, you would come up with some ideas for the visuals, which was a key point in the whole thing. You kind of came up with a storyboard of sorts, or an idea of what might be happening on screen. That was really helpful for me to try to visualize what might occur, because it's not like the story of The Storm wasn't a narrative. It wasn't your voiceover wasn't telling a linear story. It was like reflections on things, and the thing about putting illustrations into an animation is that you kind of need to, there kind of needs to be some sort of arc or something like that. Like if it's just kind of, it feels the same way the whole time, then it's not going to be very interesting for people. People want to be kind of drawn into something and then experience something, and then at the end feel like something has occurred that's interesting. So with any animation project, part of the design process is just figuring out the workflow, figuring out what tools you're going to use, how you're going to put it together. Like this was, I didn't draw everything on paper for this. I used a tablet so that I could draw on the computer and make it easier to edit. And then, I had to composite it in this program called After Effects. Basically bring together all the different drawings, and then I put textures over top of it, and that's where I edited it all. So figuring out that we call it like a pipeline was very important for this whole thing, to keep it organized. The sketchbook idea, yes, it came from kind of, if you're, we're all locked down. We were all locked down at the time, and thinking about what tools you have around you. Maybe you just have a sketchbook and a pencil, and I almost imagined maybe you kind of sketching and then having kind of daydreams also while you're sketching. So there's sequences in the film that kind of go into the past that take up more of the full frame, and just to kind of see that come together. So it was intentional, and it served multiple purposes. Yeah, it was a little more reasonable to accomplish within the time frame, but aesthetically, I think it worked really well. And one thing that we ended up focusing on was this one color. So we used a color palette that was just gray and like a light kind of cream colored paper, but then this like yellow color, and that was there from the beginning, I guess. I don't know why, but the yellow color kind of became a character in the film, I guess, that it kind of could represent different things at different times. And we had a fair bit of discussion about that, because I think your natural instinct was to add more color, and I agreed with you on a certain level, and I tried that, but it just wasn't working for me, and I couldn't kind of expand the palette back past this yellow. Yeah, it was really fun. It was really enjoyable for me. The National Film Board is this amazing kind of gem of a organization that allows you to kind of be creative and without many limits. The producers there aren't they want you to kind of be artistic and be creative, and so it was like a dream for me.
Me too. And even to be able to just get the feedback of people incredibly important in this discipline of filmmaking. We got I think were really intrigued to get some feedback from other animators at the National Film Board. I got to go up to Montreal and do the final sound mix in a sound booth in Montreal, which to me, from my old radio days, I was expecting this sweaty little closet of a room. But no, it's a theater with an audio professional sitting at a massive board, and her turning around going, how did that sound? Did you want to adjust this in a certain way? I thought I had literally died and gone to heaven.
They just got nominated for another Oscar for one of their films, and there's like 73 nominations they've had or something like that. Not that Oscars are the be all end all, but they really just, the caliber is very high for their productions.
It's not bad though. It's not the be all end all. It's not bad. I wouldn't say no to an Oscar, for example.
Yeah, too shiny. Those Oscars are too shiny. No thanks.
Yeah. All right. Thanks very much, Duncan.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's good to chat.
So I'm going to just talk a little bit about letterpress. So letterpress is this really interesting discipline that is, hundreds of years old, and there's a bit of a resurgence in letterpress design and publication, I think, over the last, say, 20 years or so. But we're still using the technology that's we're still using presses made 100 years ago and 70 years ago. So I wanted to talk to you about just one particular project as a way to give you an insight into the the flow of how I make a broadside. So a broadside is also known as a broadsheet. It's basically just something printed on one side of the piece of paper. Think of a pamphlet, something that like a flyer that would be handed around, or 100 years ago, maybe someone would hand you a manifesto printed on one side of a sheet of paper. That's a broadside. Mostly now, I think we see them popping up as wall art more than anything. So this, I went for a walk a couple of years ago in the woods and came across a deer carcass. This was up in Alberta in the Rocky Mountains, and came across this deer carcass. And I thought it was a beautiful thing to see in the world. So I took a picture of these two hooves. I liked the way the hooves were arranged. And I wrote a poem about the deer, and I wanted to turn it into a broadside. So I started by taking this picture of the hooves. And then I'm skipping ahead here. This is the final project that I ended up making. I'm going to just deconstruct it here for you a little bit. So I wrote this poem. We warped through the weft to find her a bed, hooves a cascade of fingers, and still as winter, gentle dead man's smile. So I started with that image of the hooves, and then I brought that into PowerPoint and turned it into layers, color layers. It was too complicated, obviously, to get every color in that. So I decided to make it easier for myself, and I just decided to break that into 2 color layers. So basically the black and the brown. And then what I did is I exported those color layers as just a plain old JPEG, and I send it to a company that makes these printer's plates. So you make a plate that's an exact height. It's set, this is magnesium set on some kind of hardwood. They just take your JPEG and they manufacture it, and it's sent to me. So because I have 2 printer's blocks with 2 separate images, I can then overprint one on the other. So does that make sense? The image there on the left of your screen was the black, and the one on the right of your screen was the brown. So if I lock it up, if I print it in exactly the same place in the paper, because those lines are in slightly different places, you'll get the 2 colors laid over top. And then the words part. So letterpress is literally the act of going through drawers of metal type and pulling out every single letter and putting in spacing and locking it up precisely. So you can imagine when you have that many tasks, how many opportunities there are for failure of your project. It's absolutely maddening. So when you get something you like, it's a bit of it's a bit of a miracle. This is just a picture of the inside of my very dirty shop. So these are drawers of type, and some of the type was made last year, and some of it was made 100 years ago. It's just a bit of an eclectic collection there. And then the type drawers, I should have taken a picture of the drawer, I apologize, but this is a map of a type drawer. So it's not laid out like a keyboard, like a QWERTY keyboard or anything. Each little section of the drawer has a pile of C's, a pile of D's, a pile of E's. So if I want to print the word the, I go to the little drawer that has the capital T's, and then I come over and I pick a lowercase h and a lowercase e, and I set them all in a line, and then I put in a space before I start spelling the next words. The spaces, again, are individual objects. I just keep mine in little paint tins like this, labeled with all the different sizes. So sort of like, the way you might organize your fastener cabinet in your garage, same idea. And then you get something that looks like this in the end. I have one slide out of order here. So this is a cabinet of what we call reglets and spacers. And so these are wooden strips, furniture and reglets, and they're wooden strips that basically separate lines of type from each other. So you can see here, this thing there with all the letters in it is called a form. And so inside the form, you can see that there are sort of blank slugs. Those are the spacers of different sizes. And then each little sort is like a W is a sort, an E is a sort. And it's where the phrase out of sorts comes from. Because you can imagine if you were setting this and you ran out of eyes and you couldn't finish the project, you were out of sorts, you'd be really out of sorts. So that's where that comes from. Anyway, you get a form like this, and you tie a piece of string around it to keep it together so it doesn't fall apart and you lose all your work. If you drop that on the floor, you have pied the type, and you're banned from the shop. No, just kidding. But it does happen, but it's really horrendous when it happens, because you can imagine the work it takes to put something like that back together. So you get a form, and then you lock it up in a chase. So this is not the same form, obviously, but you can imagine, instead of that printer's block that has postcard on it, you take that out and you would put the form in there, and then all those blocks of wood around it, it's like Lego. For adults, you just put the blocks in there to get it sort of cinched up. And then that black bar that you see over to the left side of the screen with the hole in it, that's called a coin. So you actually fit sort of like a screwdriver kind of device inside it, and you ratchet it out, and it just cinches everything up. There's one on the bottom there as well. So once you've got it all cinched up, you should be able to pick up the chase and, not have anything fall out. And you get really sad if that happens, but you get it all locked up, nice and solid, and then you put it on a press. So I have two different types of presses in my workshop. This one is called a Platen Press. So there's that sort of round disc at the top, that's where the ink goes. So you take a can of ink and you take a little palette and you put a small amount of ink on top. Every time you pull down on that lever, the inking disc is going around with a little ratchet. And the rollers, you can see those little green sort of horizontal bars there. Those are rubber rollers, and they come up over those vertical rails, and they go all the way over the inking disc. And you do that a bunch of times, and the ink spreads out evenly, ideally, over the rollers. And the type that you've just set up in your chase goes on that vertical section there between those two rails, if that makes sense. And your paper goes on the other half of that clamshell, and you clamp it in place. So you haul down on that lever, it brings up the paper. As you haul down on the lever, the rollers go up over the ink, it inks the type, and it brings the paper towards the type like that. And you pull it, you get a kiss, you want a certain depth on your paper, and then it falls apart, and you take out your paper, and you've got your first print. So that's a Platen Press. The other style of press I have in my shop is a cylinder press like this. So instead of the type going vertically, the type goes on the bed of the press there, and you lock it all up. The rollers spin over. In this case, the inking disc is another roller under there that you can't see, and so the rollers are just rolling over top of themselves, and ink is being spread really thinly, sort of like oil, in a piston or something. And then the paper goes up on top of the black bit at the very back of the press on the top. That's where the paper gets locked in. And then that black crank on the side, you push that forward, and the rollers move from like where they are on the left part of the screen. They roll all the way down the press bed. And so the paper is brought to the type in that way. But similar principle, just a different outlay. Obviously, this yellow press is much bigger than the tabletop one, so I can accommodate much bigger type. And then at the end, if you've locked up everything and you're excellent at paper registration and making sure that, those two layers, those two color layers have aligned well, you'll get an image that's appealing. Keep in mind that you've had to clean the press in between every different color you use, because you have to re-ink it with a different color. And then you get a thing with words at the end. So I just wanted to finish with, this is Andrew Steeves. He is the publisher of Gasborough Press, and Gasborough has published 4 books of poetry. Andrew is a master letterpress artist, and we talk a lot about the challenges of trying to keep your head in many different projects at once. And I just wanted to pass along the best advice that probably anybody ever gave to me when it comes to trying to figure out what to do with your life and existential crises. And Andrew likes to say, focus on the verbs, not the nouns. So focus on the task at hand, not necessarily what it means. And and you'll be fine. So I don't know how much time we have for questions there, Kyle. We had some technical malfunctions there.
We have a class coming in behind us, so we have 5 minutes before they need to get started. But if there's any questions out in the audience, we have time for one or two. So we got a mic set up down here at the front of the room. If one of you want to pop down and ask a question, or if there's anyone online, feel free to fire it up in the chat there.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. For people who couldn't hear, the question was how much with respect to the novel, how much does the paper and how much does the size of the book play into it? It's another, yeah, we didn't talk about that. That's another deliberate choice that you make. Now, having said that, one part of the process we didn't talk about is once you get the design, the file, that goes to a printer. And often printers will have their own choices of paper stock based on cost, based on aesthetic appeal, based on durability. And certainly Peddler used to get its books printed at Coach House in Toronto, and they had a beautiful paper stock that only Coach House and a few other publishers used, and it's very distinctive. It's heavy, it's durable, it feels good in the hands. Also, the size of the book is another, in many cases, you have to decide the size of the book before you lay it out, obviously, because the size of the book is going to dictate how much text you can fit on a page. And so, yeah, those are certainly deliberate choices to make as well. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
All right, we have another class coming in, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to take any more questions. But thank you everybody out in the audience who tuned in. And a big thank you to Monica for taking the time to come and do this talk for us.
Thank
you so
you.
much, Monica,
Thanks, Scott.
for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in.